We're in Luke 24, and we might very well be able to finish Luke 24 tonight. But I've made promises like that before that I never intended to keep, so I run into that sometimes. But there's just a little bit left in the text that I want to try to get through, and if we get through it, we get through it. If we don't, we don't. That's fine. But we need to talk a little bit about these last kind of moments that Jesus has with his disciples, and we've been talking a little bit about the fact that not really any one writer gives us kind of a perfect chronology of these events after the resurrection of Jesus. Again, you've heard me argue several times that I think John probably does the best of any of them as far as even addressing the idea of chronology. You'll see language in his writings about how many days certain went by or whatever it might be. And so you kind of see that a little bit in John's record, but not so much necessarily in the records from the other gospel accounts. And so as we're working through this, keep in mind there are other narratives of the history and events of things that happened after the resurrection of Jesus that Luke doesn't necessarily record. We know that Luke records that two guys were heading where? They were going to Emmaus, and one of them was named Cleopas, or however you want to say that name, right? And we talked a little bit about what family connections he may or may not have to Jesus in a prior class. We know that while they were walking, Jesus was conversing with them, and they didn't know what? Who he was. And they later state that while Jesus was talking to them, their hearts were burning, right, as they were listening to that information and knowledge that Jesus was sharing. But it wasn't until they sat down for dinner, basically, at the end of their travels, and Jesus broke bread before them and gave thanks for it, that their eyes were opened, right, and they began to appreciate who Jesus was. Jesus then just kind of disappears out of that scene. They travel back to Jerusalem in order to have a conversation with the disciples concerning what they had witnessed. There's that odd moment that Luke kind of records, the encounter that Jesus has with Peter. It doesn't necessarily give us in what time frame that occurred. He just tells us that it does. We know from other narratives that Mary Magdalene was first, and then most likely Peter, then several hundreds others as it relates to that. And you can use 1 Corinthians 15 to kind of show you some relevance to that. But even when we mentioned that Sunday morning, Paul's not really trying to set a chronology for us in that narrative. He's just trying to get us to understand that he was a witness to Jesus out of season, basically, he says. He didn't have the same witness or time period that the other apostles had, but he kind of comes in direct contact with Jesus in a very different kind of way. That's the point he's trying to make out of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Maybe Mark chapter 16 might be a comparison to Emmaus, but in that text all he says is two guys went into the country and they encountered Jesus. He doesn't give us enough detail for us to know for certain that that's the moment. Most people kind of put it together. If you Googled, Jesus chronology after his resurrection, you'll probably get a chart that somebody has created that will put those two texts together. That moment of those two men heading towards the country in Mark chapter 16, and this scene of them going to Emmaus. They return back to Jerusalem. They're having a conversation with the disciples, and all of a sudden what? Yeah, all of a sudden, Jesus is in the midst of them. One minute, he's with them in Emmaus and leaves. They don't know where he went. The next minute, he's not there, and then he's there in the midst of those disciples. And they become what in relationship to his presence? Verse 37. Right, they're terrified. They're scared because they think they've seen a ghost, right? They're convinced that they have seen a spirit, that they've seen a ghost. He says, why are you troubled? Why do these thoughts arise in your hearts? This is what we talked about Sunday. Behold my hands and my feet, that it is myself. Handle me and see, For a spirit hath not flesh and bones, as ye see me have. And so, in this moment in time, they're convinced that Jesus is a spirit or a ghost, and Jesus wants to convince them that that's not true. Why is that important, by the way? That he can't be a spirit or a ghost. Let me ask that in a little better way. Okay, I heard several potentially good answers to that. Let me go back. So say it one more time.
He was resurrected.
Okay, what had to be resurrected? Okay, yeah, his body had to be resurrected. And the reason for that is that's what he said. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days, what? I'll raise it up again, right? Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up again. And so this has to be, he's got to go through this bodily resurrection. If not, he didn't tell them the truth. And so if his body doesn't raise from that tomb, he didn't convey the right. So he can't leave them in a state or thought that they're just experiencing a ghost-like or spirit-like figure. He's got to evidence to them his body came out of that tomb, because that's what he prophesied would happen. So how does he handle that in this moment? Okay, that's next. What's the first thing that he does? Handle me. Come and handle the wounds, and recognize that there's a legitimacy to the bodily resurrection that I've experienced. I'm not in spirit form here. You can come and handle me, touch me. Now, is there any narrative within the gospel accounts that creates some challenge to that notion?
They you will be with me in paradise. Now, if Christ's spirit went to paradise, the body laid in the grave, when the body arises, he's gone out of the spirit in the body. What he's saying is, but yet we have spirit in our body. Is that contradicting the fact that God's spirit abides with our spirit?
Well, if I'm following the question, I think his spirit returns to his body. Yeah, he's just saying, I'm not just a spirit. I'm not just a ghost. This is me back inside my body.
James says the body without the spirit is dead, but obviously he's
Right.
So he must have reunited. Some spirit does not have flesh and bones.
By itself, correct. Is that, I'm just trying to follow the question. So,
It seems to me like he's saying that his spirit is not with his body.
yeah. I don't see that. I don't think that's his point. I think his point is, I'm not just a picture, an illusion, a spirit being in your presence. This is the same body that I had prior to my crucifixion. Come see the wounds if you want to see evidence that I'm inside this same body that I had that was crucified. That is correct. That's yes. Yeah, now I understand what that is correct. Because that's what ultimately, permanently goes into eternity. His body was still in the tomb. He went to paradise with the thief on the cross. His spirit goes there, then returns back to the body, and is resurrected. That seems to be the process that we're dealing with here. And some other questions that might arise with that.
We know that
this is not the same body that Jesus had when he ascended back to heaven, because flesh and blood cannot
Yeah.
inherit 1 Corinthians 15.
Right.
So there must have been a change there somewhere.
Yeah, and maybe when we get to the ascension, we can talk about that a little bit more. But I think you're right. I think there's, and I don't have any challenge with that or trouble with that, because if he can come back into that destroyed, weakened body and revive it, then nothing's beyond him, right? And if he can easily transition from that bodily form that was necessary into that spirit form as he ascends back and to the Father. And obviously that's, even the scene itself as it unfolds illustrates to us that that moment is far different than anything he was encountering while he walked among men. But it is interesting to have to think about that he's in the bodily form while he's walking and talking among men, but he has to transition into his deity form, if you will, when he ascends back into the Father, because the texts of Scripture seem to pretty clearly indicate that flesh and blood don't transcend into that realm.
What was it? I'll think of it. I'll
Okay.
come back to it.
Raise your hand later. I'll come back. You got first dibs on my return back. If when I get, go ahead.
Appearance, that's a change. I get the feeling that they didn't recognize him.
And I suppose that could be it, right? That he looks enough different in resurrected form. And again, I'm going to, without getting morbid, but that's the same body that went into that tomb that just was, brutally treated, clear through the process, not just the crucifixion itself, but the whole process leading up to the crucifixion. His body would undoubtedly look different than the vibrant 33-year-old roughly prior to the scourging and prior to all the devastation. You know what I mean? So you could have it, I think you could have it from that aspect that he would look different. And it may, but then I don't deny the idea too that it could just be that that's the way he wants to reveal himself. That he hides who he is initially, and then all of a sudden they're able to see clearly who he is. Yeah, but it didn't experience the same things though. Yeah, in the time period, depending on how you add them up, yeah. Okay, good.
The Bible tells us no man has seen God at any time.
Yeah.
I assume that's talking about the Father. Yeah. Why is that? I believe it's because he's in a different form than we are.
Yeah.
Jesus said God is a spirit. And, Jesus was God, but yet men saw him, they touched him, they handled him, they heard him. Why? Because he was in the same form as people were when he came to earth.
Yeah.
So.
And I think you're right, Bill. I think when you think about why can't we see God, we can't see him because we're not in the same state or condition that he is in. We're not in the same form that he is in. And even those allusions within Scripture, if you notice, when people even relate the concept of seeing God, Moses talks about how he saw the backside of God as he leaves that scene there with him. So he can't see God in his fullness, and God's got to take on some other form. Jacob is said to have wrestled with God there in the mud of the Jabbok River, but the text also says that God, in that sense, took on the form of a man in order for that occasion to occur. And then that's the same with Jesus. We're able to see God through Jesus, but we're able to see him because he takes on a form like the form that we have. Now, there's a lot of that I have some clarity about, and there's a lot of eternal kinds of things that I don't know that our mortal, finite minds would ever really fully comprehend.
How do we know that he's there? It's seen. No, he's there because he said he was.
Yeah. And you have the confidence because of the promise or the commitment and the conviction we have about who he is and trustworthiness. Any other thoughts? Go ahead.
There's one other thing one time, a preacher on Facebook or on TV or what. But he said, many times the Bible describes God in terms that we can understand. Talk about the finger of God. Well,
Yeah.
God had a finger, not like we do.
Right.
But he called that anthropomorphism. Gives God the characteristics of humans that we might understand about him better.
Right. Yeah. And it is interesting because the descriptions within Scripture to try to help us understand God are often take on those kinds of forms just to give us some standard by which we can examine and think about it. Yeah. Go ahead, Ken.
Reminds me also of what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes in chapter 12, describing the old age of the body will return to the dust and the spirit will return to God again.
Yeah. And so there is definitely that disconnect between those two portions of who we are. So let me lead you back to where I was heading then. So I asked the question: are there any concerns with the idea that Jesus tells them to come and handle me in verse 39? And would there ever be any reason to think why that might be a challenge? And normally I don't ask those questions if I didn't know.
One of the accounts, I can't remember which one it was, he tells them not to touch him at the moment.
Right. So in John chapter 20, I'm going to start you towards the end of the chapter, then I'm going to move you forward. There's an interesting, what some might even consider a contradiction, even within John's record of this history. In verse 27, that's the encounter with Thomas. And most scholars, and I would tend to agree with this, parallel this moment with Thomas with what we're reading right now in Luke 24. When Jesus is telling them in Luke 24, come and see the nail prints, come and handle me, touch the wounds, recognize. Most scholars, if you looked up one of those timelines, they would put Luke 24, the latter end of this section we're looking at, and John 20:27, this moment with Thomas, as one and the same in relationship to the timing. Again, what that would mean then is that Luke kind of skips past some other moments of Jesus' encounters and just jumps to this one, if that be the case. But there's no permanent exacting statement that makes it 100% certain that they're talking about the two of the same moments. Irregardless if they're talking about the same moments, we do know they're talking about telling people to do the same thing. In Luke 24, he's saying, come handle me. In John 20:27, he says to Thomas, reach hither thy finger and behold my hands, and reach hither thy hand and thrust it into my side, and be not faithless but believing. In both accounts, Luke 24's account, handle these wounds. John 20's account, thrust your hand into my side. Touch me, right? You got to touch him in order to do that. Here's the thought that I just want you to be aware of, because someone might ask you sometime. Notice verse 17, John chapter 20. When Mary Magdalene encounters Jesus right after his resurrection, Jesus says to her, touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say unto them, I ascend unto my Father and your Father, and to my God and to your God. So to Mary Magdalene, he says, don't touch me. I haven't been back in the presence of my Father yet. I haven't ascended back yet. I'm not done yet with the work that I have to fulfill. She's told, don't touch me. Thomas has said, thrust your hand into my side. And Luke 24's record says, to Jesus tells that whole audience of disciples that are there, come handle me. Now, how do you justify that scene? Go ahead, Bob.
when he's telling her about the touching, I think what he's actually saying to her is, don't hold me up. I have things I gotta do. And the fact that for 40 days, the prime thing that he is doing, he's removing all doubt that he is risen from the grave. He wants everybody, particularly the apostles, to be convinced that it's his body.
And I agree with you. I think that's absolutely part of this scene. What else do you think? Oh. Okay, and that's going to be, I think, part of this whole conversation. Let me share with you real quick, just for definitive sake. But sorry for your eyes; it jumped back down to verse 27. The word touch there, and you'll never be able to read that probably on that screen. But the word also means to attach oneself, not just come in contact with. It means to attach oneself. Now go back to the context and think about the context in which he said that. So he says, not just don't come in contact with me, don't attach yourself to me, for I am not yet ascended to my Father, but what? Go tell my brethren that I'm. Her instinct, the one that she just witnessed suffer all of those things and was crucified upon the cross. She had been aiding and assisting him for a period of time now, and the sorrowfulness that she had to have gone through, like all the other women that had been accompanying them, he and the disciples, and aiding and assisting them, and they're witnesses to all of this. She's part of that group that wants to give him a proper what? Burial, right? She's part of that group that's coming back to the tomb on the first day of the week. Her instinct in celebration of his resurrection is to want to attach herself to him. And he says, I'm not done yet. I haven't ascended to the Father yet. This isn't over. I've got things yet to fulfill. What's left to fulfill? People have to see him, right? And enough people need to see him to legitimately be witnesses of his resurrection. Fast forward, Paul's statements in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when he talks about all those people that had seen him, he said even at one point there was as many as 500 that had seen him. And then there was one other little caveat that Paul states there. He says, and many of them are what? Still alive. There were many of those people that had seen Jesus, but by the time Paul was conversing with those in Corinth, he says they're still alive. In other words, there were still people walking, talking, and breathing on the earth when Paul writes to those in Corinth that were eyewitnesses that Jesus had raised from the dead. That's necessary in this process. So, in case you encounter that situation sometime where someone says, well, that's a contradiction. He tells them you can't touch me, and then he tells them 10 verses later to go ahead and touch him. That's two different things that are happening. In fact, if you notice, you can see it within the context in which it is said. And again, I think that when he tells Mary Magdalene, that's a different kind of thing. Don't attach yourself to me. Don't hold on to me. Go tell the brethren that I'm raised from the dead. She had a different role to take, not just to hang on to Jesus. But it's important for us to at least note those because they're interesting moments in the same descriptions of what's happening after the resurrection. Go ahead, Randy.
On that comment before, in Luke 24:37, and they were terrified. To me, that applies the apostles as a plural. And the other one we referred to in John 21:27, that's just the one person, Thomas, which he wasn't with them the first time. So I'd say those are two different times.
Yeah.
So just look at that.
And it could be, or it could be a blend, right? Luke could just be giving us a blended version because you had the disciples together, except for Thomas, and then 8 days later, John's record, you have them all assembled, and Luke could be talking about 2 different times. Maybe he's talking about the first time, but the challenge with that is back up a little further in Luke 24, and it says that when they got there, they were all there. So not -1.
But the thing I go with is, he told them to touch him. Touch his wounds, see what they're like. When he goes to Thomas, he's just talking to Thomas only. You touch him since you wasn't there.
Right.
So that's where.
Yeah. And the other reason, right, and I get what you're saying, and it doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't feel like it matches exactly, and it doesn't necessarily match exactly. And maybe the intent in some ways of what they're trying to convey. But my point I was simply illustrating to you was in verse 33. This assembly of people, he says, when those 2 guys got there from Emmaus, he says, and found the 11 gathered. Judas is dead, and so the only 11 would have to include Thomas at that stage. That's why I say Luke's just giving us a synopsis viewpoint, and quite possibly also giving us a more detailed viewpoint of this offer, if they needed further evidence, was very specifically related to Thomas and John's record. But that opportunity wasn't exclusive to him. That all of these disciples that were gathered here had been at some point or another, whether it's the same scene or not, all of them were offered the same opportunity if they needed that further justification in their mind that that's legitimately him. And that probably sounded like a big echo chamber to folks at home. I forgot my button. Any other thoughts? Okay, so they're in celebration mode, verse 41, but they're still what? Yeah, they're still not sure. Okay, they're excited because the text says, and while they yet believed not, but the reason their disbelief is still, there's just this joy and wonderment, right? That they're in the emotional stage here. And they're not sure what they believe about what's going on in front of them, but they're excited about it. And there's this joy and wonderment happening as it relates to it. And then he offers them this second layer of evidence that it's legitimately his bodily resurrection. What is it? Yeah, I'm hungry. Yeah, I'm hungry. Have you here any meat or food? And so they gave him a piece of broiled fish and of an honeycomb, and he took it and did eat. What's the key there? Before them, right in front of them. Okay. Something that even they would have had to admit that a spirit or a ghost couldn't have done, right? That he is helping them. First, come see the wounds. Come touch the wounds. Second, watch me consume food. If you're struggling with conviction about this genuineness of what's going on. And then he speaks. These are the words which I spoke unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses, and in the prophets, and in the Psalms concerning me. He said, everything that had been written about me, I had to fulfill it all. I couldn't change it. I couldn't shortcut it. All of it. And I've been trying to help all of you appreciate that this resurrection, this bodily resurrection, has always been part of this plan. And bear witness to it, because, and here's the interesting part that maybe we forget. Jesus, and for God's right to choose how he wants to convey his knowledge, right? Could Jesus have just kind of, he's already proven he can be in a scene and not in a scene, and then back in a scene and then not in a scene, right? He's already proven that a couple of different times that he's able to do that. Why not just appear to everybody? Right? I mean, it's a fair question in some ways. Why not just... And I think the answer to that question is that wasn't the way God designed for it to happen. The way God designed for that information to flow was through earthen vessels, witnesses, people that would experience Him and see Him. He wasn't planning to stay among them on the earth in any form, whether it be a new king over Israel or just in any other. The fulfillment was to fulfill the purpose and ascend back to His rightful place at the right hand of God. And so he says, I've got to fulfill all of these things, but He's got to have legitimate... If these men have any doubts, how are they going to be able to convict anybody else of what they saw and experienced with you? They're going to have to be able to go tell the story with confidence and validity and trustworthiness. And if there is any ounce of doubt or wonder about the legitimacy of any of it, they're not going to be very good witnesses. And people aren't going to listen to them. And so Jesus has got to get this, especially this nucleus of disciples, fully persuaded and convicted of every ounce of the fulfillment of what He's doing, because they've got to go tell the story. Go ahead, Ken.
Jesus, being the master teacher, just gave them a very vivid show and tell, a very vivid visual aid. His wounds, the food, and then as they're consider that, he goes back and says, this is what the law of Moses, the law and the prophets and the Psalms said. And you can see their mind turning. That's what Moses and the others knew.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what happens in the next verse in 45 when he says, then opened He their understanding, that they might understand the Scriptures. All of those things that they had been reading potentially all their lives in that Old Testament prophecies and law has just been fulfilled in front of them. And His efforts here are to try to get them to appreciate and understand His fulfilling of those things and the accomplishment of the work and purposes that He had determined. Go ahead, Ring.
And one thing, the question there was in 1 Corinthians 1:21, it's by the foolishness of preaching that He didn't show everybody.
Yeah.
That's the way God set it up. Preach it, that's the way it is. So these are the preachers. They get ready to go.
Right, they're going to be those initial witnesses. Yeah, absolutely. And that was and I agree with you. That's God's design. Whether we think it's, I don't think I want to argue with God, right, about how He chooses to fulfill those things. You know, thoughts. Oop, go ahead. No, you're good.
This evidence was in three forms. They saw Him, they heard Him, and they touched Him.
They're getting all of the evidence necessary to know exactly what happened and how they should process that.
I think of it too many people. Why didn't they see Him?
Yeah.
It just wasn't shown to them, or it wasn't even discussed.
Yeah, and that, you know, why didn't any of them notice certain things about Him initially? I don't know that we'll have a full understanding of whether he did not reveal Himself in that form to them initially, or whether they just weren't looking for it, right? They're just, I mean, if you think about those guys, they're just traveling down the road. And all of a sudden, a third person joins the travel and begins to have a conversation with them and acts as if he's oblivious, right? If you remember the original conversation, when Jesus joins Himself to Cleopas and the other man traveling, he acts like he doesn't even know what happened in Jerusalem. And so their initial instinct is to not, this guy doesn't even know who Jesus is, let alone that it's Jesus Himself. And so it is interesting, though.
More information to substantiate what they believed and what they were supposed to do.
Yeah.
That was their joy, that they were perceiving, yes, this is Christ, but we need some more evidence.
Yeah.
To substantiate.
This might be dumb, but in verse 16, when it says, but their eyes were holden that they should not know Him. So we might not know exactly how that was done.
Yeah.
We just have to leave it.
No, I think you're right. I think that there's an aspect of this where certain things are being understood and revealed to them in the timing in which Jesus wants it to happen. And I think that's definitely part of this process. Yeah.
First John chapter 1, when they say that they have came to him, they seen him, they did all this with him,
Yeah.
what they're doing now.
Any other thoughts? Appreciate all that. So he says to them, verse 46, "Thus it is written, and thus it behooved Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead the third day, and that repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name among all nations, beginning at Jerusalem." So Jesus tells them, listen, everything that's happening is happening according to the plans and purposes of God. None of this is coincidental. None of it is arbitrary. It is all purpose-filled. It is all exactly what God desired and intended. It's the fulfillment of the tremendous plan of salvation and hope and promise that comes to God. And so they have to be witnesses, because the next thing that they're going to have to go out and do is what? Yeah, they got to preach that message. That repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name among all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. That in essence is what we often call the what? The Great Commission, right? We typically think of that out of Mark 16:16 or other texts like that, or Matthew's record. But I think that's what Luke's recording here, the same concept, that Jesus is instructing his disciples that a message of salvation and remission of sins in his name is going to have to be presented, because that's the plan and purpose that God designed from the start. And again, they're going to have to be the initial ones to take that message to all nations. And it starts where? Jerusalem. Not unusual then, when Paul makes the comment about salvation, he said to the Jew first and also to the Greek, right? He even references what Jesus tells them here was going to happen. And he says, and you are what? You're witnesses to these things. The center of the gospel message is what three elements? Yeah, the death, burial, and resurrection. You men have witnessed all of those. You all are the legitimate eyewitnesses to all of those things. To the central aspect of the gospel, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And the hope and promise that's going to come through that message is going to have to be delivered through you. Your voices are what's going to take that message to the world.
Him saying, starts at Jerusalem. I just had that feeling that he wants to take the forgiveness of sins to the killers, the murderers of his body first. So that's where it ended.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm right in supposing that that's the reason why he would say that. I know we're not told why, but I just felt because that's the place where the murders, where he was unjustly killed, and now he wants to offer them their forgiveness first.
Well, and I think there's lots of things at work here. It's the plan and purposes of God to start there with his original earthly house, Israel, right? That's within the plans and purposes of God from the start, that this messaging would begin with the very people that he used to bring Jesus into existence. I think I can find some consistency in the fact of among the things that Luke records for us that Jesus says is what? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, but they don't know how to find that forgiveness yet. Well, the very first place that the messaging of forgiveness comes is to the audience of people that Jesus looked down from the cross at and said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And so I think there's some consistency there as it relates to that. Any last second thoughts? So next Wednesday, we'll finish this text up and finish our discussion of the book of Luke. Probably start reading the book of Isaiah. If I change my mind by Sunday, I'll let you know. But I think that's where I'm going. What I want to do is I want to go back, and it made me feel like in reverse a little bit. But Jesus talks about how he fulfills all the law and the prophets. So let's go back and take a look at some of those prophets, particularly Isaiah's messaging about the coming Savior, and make some comparisons. So I don't know whether, my challenge, I think that's where I'm going. I just don't know in what manner yet. I don't know whether I'm doing big picture or finite detail. That's where I'm going to be figuring out. So next Wednesday, though, we'll finish up Luke, maybe look at a few questions, maybe handle anything left over, and potentially introduce the book of Isaiah next Wednesday. Remember, we're going to, starting this coming Sunday, we're Wednesday night will be Wednesday night study. It'll stay. And so whatever we're staying on Wednesday, it will always be on Wednesday. And I've got this new study that we introduced last Sunday morning. And so every Sunday, that week's material will be back there on the table for the following Sunday. So what's back there right now is for this coming Sunday. Then what will be back there this coming Sunday will be for the next week. And I explained all that during Bible class last week. And if you weren't here for that and need an explanation, just come see me.